Hey everyone, I'm Dan Joseph with MRC TV. Today we are talking to a very special guest, Mr. Jonah Goldberg. He's a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, New York Times best-selling author, and his new book, The Tyranny of Cliches, How Liberals Cheat in the War on Ideas. It's a terrific read, and we're going to talk to him a little bit about the book. How are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you?
Not too bad. So tell us a little bit about what you're hoping to accomplish with this book, and explain what you're referring to when you talk about political cliches.
Sure. First of all, I'm hoping to crush my enemies and hear the lamentations of the women. But
sounds reasonable.
But beyond that, now, my first book, Liberal Fascism, was kind of a pretty heavy read, and I wanted to have a little more fun. And so part of the point of this book is to entertain the reader a little bit more than with Liberal Fascism. But in some ways, this is sort of a sequel to Liberal Fascism in the sense that Liberal Fascism was an attempt to debunk this grand myth of American politics it was sort of like a magnet next to the compass that was distorting our understanding of the political geography, which said that fascism was a phenomenon of the right, and that the more you moved to the right in American politics, the closer you got to fascism, which is just simply not true. American libertarianism is not remotely fascist, and American social conservatism is not remotely fascist. In this book, I sort of do the same thing, but with a little more fun, with a whole bunch of these sorts of cliches. It's not about phrases. It's not about bumper stickers. Republicans and conservatives, they use cliches and bumper stickers and all that kind of stuff. Maybe not as much as liberals, but they certainly do it enough that it would be hypocritical for me to say that they don't use them.
But some of them are very effective, and that's sort of what you write about, not just in the context of today's progressives, but throughout history. It's really a historical book.
Right. I mean, so I'm talking about cliched ideas.
Okay.
Right. And in Politics in the English Language, George Orwell has this fantastic, it's one of the best essays of the 20th century. And he talks about how, he doesn't use the word cliche, but it's basically what he means, euphemisms and whatnot, stale language, that these things end up doing your thinking for you. And there are all of these cliched ideas, these cliched formulations that we indoctrinate kids with, that we indoctrinate Americans with through popular culture, through the media, in language and literature, that sort of stack the deck against conservatism, stack the deck in favor of sort of a progressive statist outlook on life. And what I try to do is I try to go through a bunch of them and debunk them and sort of set the record straight.
When Barack Obama first came on the scene as candidate, both he himself and the media presented him sort of as what you call a pragmatist, somebody who was going to blur the lines between red and blue, bring us all together. Now, of course, as conservatives, we all know that turned out to be a total ruse, and a lot of us saw it coming. But what exactly, you write a lot about this discrepancy.
Sure.
What's the difference between a pragmatist and an ideologue?
First of all, spelling. But second of all, I mean, this is sort of the central point of the book, right? This is the conceit of the book, is that that everyone is ideological, by my point of view.
We're all
right?
ideologues.
We all have, and what I mean by ideologue is I don't necessarily mean some sort of crazy worldview that ensorcels you and brainwashes you and drives you to do things. I just mean we all have a worldview. We all have a set of political priorities, a set of values that we bring to politics. The difference between conservatives and liberals is that conservatives admit it. We say, hey, I'm a conservative. I'm a libertarian. This is where I come from. This is what I believe, and this is why I argue for the things I argue for. Liberals, the first and foremost, they lie to themselves. They think they're not ideological. President Obama loves to say how he doesn't believe in ideology. He only cares about what works. He doesn't care where the ideas come from. Jonathan Chait, Paul Krugman, a lot of these liberal writers, they constantly talk about how liberals only care about what the best policies are and about doing good, and they don't have any ideological agenda. And so what I argue is that, first of all, that's just nonsense. And the idea of looking back on Obama's first 3.5 years and saying, wow, this was a guy who had no ideology and was just married to the best practices and only cared about what works, you sort of, if you believe that, you should probably quit your day job as a taste tester at a lead paint factory.
But they believe they're governing based on facts. That's what they argue. They say, well, we have the facts on our side. They don't. Therefore, we're the pragmatists, and they're just repeating what they've heard and repeating what they believe, even though it's wrong.
Right. But this is a kind of propaganda. Because first of all, there's no inherent contradiction between having an ideology and having a grasp of the facts. Right. Take abortion. Right. Whatever position you come down on abortion, whether you're pro-life or pro-choice, it's an ideological question at the end of the day. Do you value the sovereignty of the woman's right to choose over the life of the unborn, or do you value the value of life over the sovereignty of the woman's right to choose? Whichever side you come down on, it's an ideological proposition, but only liberals Only the pro-choice side is cast as non-ideological, and the pro-lifers are cast as ideological. And so the argument of the book is that liberal ideology tends to manifest itself in these cliches. It sort of bubbles up in phrases like social justice or getting on the right side of history or fairness or community. These sorts of ideas that have loaded within them deeply ideological propositions, deeply ideological commitments, and yet at the same time they deny that they're ideological at all.
Talk about fairness for a bit,
Sure.
because that's actually not a chapter in the book,
Right.
and I was a little bit surprised because that seems to be the key phrase that's going to be the centerpiece
Right.
of this election cycle, and you have Occupy talking about fairness. The
Right.
entire left establishment is going to be discussing this. You left that out as a chapter, but
It
it underlies the entire part.
And it's deeply part of the social justice chapter, right? Because social justice, Obama often says he wants to do X or Y because of social justice. He thinks it's a social justice issue to have a more equitable distribution of America's resources and wealth. That's why he wants to spread the wealth around. That's why when he was asked by Charlie Gibson in the presidential debates in 2008 whether even if you could prove that raising the capital gains tax would raise less revenue and lowering it would raise more revenue,
He said he'd do it anyway.
he still would raise it on the issues of fairness and social justice, right? I mean, that's so the fairness thing is sort of a subset of that. And the problem with the fairness argument is that it stacks the deck into a very specific and ideological understanding of fairness. Imagine you have two sons, right? And one son does all his homework, works hard, does all his chores, is conscientious and diligent and helpful and gets great grades, and the other son is just a total slacker and spends most of his day just arranging his bongs while he sits on the couch. Now you might love them both the same. In fact, you should love them both the same, but you don't treat them the same, right? You don't say out of fairness we're going to have the same rules for both of you, because one kid has earned your trust, one kid has not. And the same thing goes with this concept of fairness. The left's conception of fairness is that if you work twice as hard as somebody else, you shouldn't be able to keep as much. You should still end up with the same amount of money as the other guy. And the argument that the right says about fairness is that we all should have an equal shot at accomplishing something. But if you work harder than the other guy,
but the left would come out and argue, well, they're not really working harder than the other guy. They're getting their gains somewhere else in some way that's unfair.
Yeah, no, and I'm perfectly happy to have that argument about what is fair. But what we have that comes out of the left is that there's only one real conception of fairness. And it seems to me if you ask people, and the polling on this is pretty clear, should you be able to keep the rewards of your great idea or your labors and that kind of thing, is that fair? And people say yes. I mean, earned success is a very important thing. What the left's approach is, they work from the assumption behind social justice is very different than the assumption behind the free market. The assumption behind the free market is that the money you make is yours, and then you have to give up some of it for the necessary things that government does. The conception behind social justice is that it's everybody's money, and the government gets to decide how much of the government's money, in effect, you get to keep.
We asked some people. It was the first chapter I read, the social justice chapter, because I was fascinated by that phrasing in that subject. And I asked some people in the office, and some of them, most of them, because we are a conservative organization, said, "Oh, it's just code for government redistribution of the wealth." A couple other people said, "Well, the left, not necessarily the left, but people who think they're fighting for social justice, all they want is for the poor to have access to basic necessities." And they don't necessarily say how they want to get it, although usually it's government, who's going to be doing most of the heavy lifting. But that's the key. Isn't that that's a reasonable desire, right? For if you put social justice into those terms.
I'm in favor of all sorts of things, right? I'm in favor of everyone's garbage being collected. That doesn't mean I'm in favor that the government collect everyone's garbage. I am in favor of. I'm deeply persuaded by a book called Never Enough by by Bill Vogelli, and his argument is that there's no limiting principle to the left's understanding of the role of government. That there's never enough, right? We saw this on display with the Obamacare Supreme Court hearing, where the Solicitor General was asked, "What's your limiting principle? How far are you willing to take the Commerce Clause? Is it really true that the government can force people to eat broccoli?" And the Solicitor General could not answer the question. It was the mother of softball questions. The idea that he wasn't going to be asked some version of this in the most important case of the last, half century, is beyond conceivable. But the reason he couldn't answer it is because they can't answer it. In all the commentary about this, they still haven't come up with a good answer about what he should have said. And that's the problem with the social justice conception of things. There is no limiting principle to what the government can do. I think the truly needy deserve or are entitled to a certain level of help from government. I don't think we want to live in a country where people are starving on the street. I don't want to live in a country where we go back where old people are eating out of garbage cans. And if the government has to be involved in helping people to that extent, I can live with a small welfare system.
But is social justice a thing? I mean, you
Well, it
seem
is
to
a
argue
thing,
that
yeah.
it's not really. It can mean anything you want it to mean.
Well, that's the genius of the phrase, is that on the serious intellectual left, social justice is a real thing. But no one wants to defend it or explain it in mainstream American politics. They just want to say it as if it's this abracadabra word that allows them to get away with whatever they want to do. If you actually do the intellectual history of it, it's a really sad irony. The concept of social justice was originally developed by a theologian in the Catholic Church named Taparelli, and it was basically the idea of civil society. It was those realms of society outside of government control. And by the end of the 19th century, the left had reappropriated the word and changed its meaning to basically say that social justice is the right of government to do good where it can, when it can, whenever it can, in any aspect of our lives, to even out disparities, to even out anything that is perceived of as unfairness. And that's why I think, this Julia thing that the Obama campaign has come up with, the life of Julia. The creepy thing to me about it isn't, and it's creepy on a whole bunch of levels.
She doesn't have a face.
She's
really creepy.
I think the creepiest sentence in American politics in the last 50 years is, under President Obama, Julia decides to have a child. That just wigs me out. But the stuff that is truly creepy about it are the long gaps where the government isn't involved in her life. Because I think from the perspective of social justice, they look at those gaps and say, look how much more work there is to do. At the end of the day, there is no limiting principle to social justice, because at the core, what liberalism is an argument about what government should do, what God should do if God existed. And since God doesn't exist, government should do it.
Another abracadabra word, since you already used that, you use it again in the book, with diversity. And I like this quote. You say, diversity is an abracadabra word that makes inconvenient facts disappear.
Right.
Explain what you mean by that.
Look, it all depends on what you mean by diversity. I like diversity. I grew up in New York City. I'm a product of a mixed marriage. My brother is married to a Haitian girl. I like, diverse cultures, diverse food, diverse this, diverse that. I like all that stuff. I also like diverse stock portfolios. There are lots of things that diversity is good about. But when we say diversity is strength, we say it as a way to sort of short-circuit an argument about things. And my chief problem with diversity is the way it basically empowers a certain set of social planners and social engineers to permanently have the legitimacy and the authority to organize life and institutions according to the lines that they see fit. The old argument about affirmative action, which I think was an honorable and serious argument, we can have debates about its implementation and that kind of thing, but it was a serious argument that said, fundamentally, it is, as LBJ put it, it is unfair, it is unjust to keep a man in chains for his whole life and then take them off one day and expect him to compete honestly in a race. And so the original concept of affirmative action was to help a specific group of people who were significantly wronged by the American society. The new argument about diversity is that diversity is a good in and of itself, and therefore college administrators and government bureaucrats can now and forever organize society along the lines that they see fit. And it is the permanence that is the real problem, because, and it's just simply not true that diversity is a key ingredient to education, or at least it's not proven. It's also not true about communities necessarily. Robert Putnam at Harvard, a liberal sociologist, found that, after doing a massive, massive survey of the United States, that neighborhoods that become more diverse, and I'm not just talking about black and white, but Hispanics and other ethnicities and all the rest, social metrics of social strength deteriorate.
What does that mean by metrics of social strength?
Volunteerism, community events.
There's simply less of it.
Neighborliness.
Okay.
People tend to hunker down and stay in their own homes watching TV.
And you also mentioned that the more diverse a college campus is, and I think there have been multiple studies on this, that the members of the different races and different ethnicities tend to stay in groups with members of their own races and ethnicities.
I go to a lot of college campuses, and what you tend to find, and I think it's sort of sad, is that you see the black students eating with the black students, the Asian students eating with the Asian students, white students eating with white students. And if the point is diversity, we shouldn't be seeing that. But again, I think we overthink all of this stuff. Personally, I think Morehouse College, which is an historically black school, I don't think it's a national scandal that they don't have enough white people in it. And I'm not saying that we should keep black people out of universities. I'm just saying that we fought a civil war, we amended the Constitution a couple times, we had a civil rights movement based upon the proposition that the government should not be in the business of picking winners and losers based upon their race. And the diversity argument is a way to empower that understanding of the society permanently. It's one thing if we want to get back, again, the redressing the wrongs of Jim Crow and slavery, it's a legitimate moral argument, and we can have an argument about how the best way to do that. But to tell me that it's okay for Harvard to be importing African kids from Africa in order to hit their quotas for black students strikes me as preposterous.
Do they do that?
Yeah, oh, sure.
I didn't know that. It's fascinating. You touch on a very sensitive topic when you talk a little bit about patriotism. And basically the point you're making is that, first of all, you say, you really can't, it's difficult to be considered a patriot if you want to change almost everything about your own country. Do you think that liberals love America? I mean, you talk about how they change their position on the country based on who's in power, and conservatives do it to a certain extent too. But are liberals patriotic?
But look, the depends what you mean, right? But the tendency is when liberals run the U.S. government, conservatives become hate the government more and like the government less and love the country more, right? You get the same thing with the Tea Parties, where we start returning to our founding principles and all of this kind of stuff, and we've been more caught up in our patriotic fervor. When Republicans run the country, the rhetoric from liberals is not just anti-government, it's anti-American. I mean, we're talking about it as a gross generalization here. And so, the problem I have, you take about dissent is the highest form of patriotism, right? And first of all, John O'Sullivan has this great formulation where he says, okay, so if dissent is the highest form of patriotism, treason is the highest form of dissent, therefore treason must be the highest form of patriotism. The patriotism of dissent is entirely dependent upon what you are dissenting from. If I say I love America and you call me an idiot, you're dissenting from what I'm saying, but your dissent is not necessarily patriotic. And I find one of the more fascinating things about liberal rhetoric, if you listen to Obama or if you listen to just liberals generally, is they focus more on words like unity, which are a much safer harbor than they do on the words like patriotism, which make them uncomfortable. And so I simply say that patriotism is, America is not a nationalistic country. It is a patriotic country. They're different things. Hitler always used to say he was a nationalist and not a patriot. Americans are patriots and they're not nationalists. We do not, for the most part, have a blood and soil conception of the kind of country that we are.
But patriotism does imply that you're proud of something, not just that we have free speech or that what we have now, you're proud of something that the country's done in its history. You're proud of what we've done, what we've become. Can you honestly say that there are a lot of progressives out there who believe that?
Well, I can say when you ask them, what they're proud about America, it's almost always about the reform movements, right? I mean, that's what they align themselves with. I don't say that liberals are unpatriotic. I say that liberals are hopelessly confused about the issue of patriotism, and I think that's essentially true. I think that at the end of the day, these people they love America, but there's a serious degree of cognitive dissonance and confusion when you say, I love America, but I really want to fundamentally transform it, right? I mean, you'd say to your wife, honey, I love you. I can't tell you how much I love you. I just want to fundamentally transform you. See how she takes it, and yet that is the rhetoric everyone from John Kerry, Howard Dean, Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama is, they used to say, we're just days away from the election. They say, we're just days away from fundamentally transforming America. And yet when conservatives say, these guys are out to fundamentally transform America, the response is always, oh, you're so paranoid.
Right.
No, I'm just quoting them, And so again, there is, of course, inside of liberalism, if you talk to serious liberal intellectuals, fascinating dinner time conversations about this whole idea that comes from the Enlightenment about, Parliament of Man and Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the idea that national boundaries are problematic. A lot of libertarians are sort of on the liberal side about this, and that, the idea of nationalism or national, let's call it national attachment, is troubling at a theoretical level for a lot of liberals. Some of it for perfectly good, honest reasons. I disagree with them. I think a little nationalism is a good thing. A lot is terrible. But that's true of almost everything. A poison is determined by the dosage. A little arsenic can, clear up your rheumatoid arthritis. A lot will kill you.
Can it?
I don't know.
You're not recommending that our viewers try that.
Let me put it this way: a little red wine is great for your heart. A gallon of Everclear will kill you. And that's true of all poisons, and that's true of all ideas. A sort of a little national sentiment. On Thanksgiving is our most nationalistic holiday, right? It comes from before the founding of the country. It's not creedal. It's not like the 4th of July, which celebrates a document. It's about our connection with God and land and all that. I think that's wonderful. You take it any farther than that, and you start getting into trouble.
When I was reading this, you started mentioning some of the cliches you're talking about. I was sitting there going, uh-oh, I've said that.
Oh, sure.
And you do argue that conservatives are bound by a lot of these cliches. Yeah. Can you give us an example of some of them, some of the most common that conservatives bind themselves to?
Sure. All conservatives use slippery slope all of the time. And in fact, I kind of, at the end of the slippery slope chapter, defend it to a certain extent because it is a natural human tendency it's actually a very smart evolutionary strategy to worry about, if I do this, will it lead to something really bad, right? If the cavemen who were walking around absolutely unconcerned about whether or not they would attract a saber-toothed tiger probably didn't pass along their genes. So worrying about chain reactions and causal implications of things is actually hardwired into us, and that's a good thing. But at the same time, the problem with the slippery slope, or let's take it to a whole cluster of them, the right side of history, right? We're hearing that a lot right now.
I've used that one.
First of all, there's as Robert Conquest, the historian, puts it, there's a certain Marxist twang to the idea of the right side of history, as if history unfolds in a deterministic way, right? That it's just pointing in one direction. Or the 20/20 hindsight. Hindsight's not 20/20. If hindsight was 20/20, we would never have any arguments about history. No one would argue about what caused World War II or whether the New Deal ended the Great Depression.
Now that argument, right side of history, has come up more often in the gay marriage debate because we do see trends. We see that the trends in the United States are changing towards favoring or being all right with gay marriage, and it's hard to see them going the other way.
And I'll say
and nobody wants to sit there and be called a bigot or
sure. But look, let me just say for that front that I don't think gay marriage is all that terrifying a proposition. That's not where I'm coming from on this. But at the same time, there's something deeply undemocratic about saying, you fools, why are you opposing gay marriage? You just need to get on the right side of history, right? Because what they're really saying is you should drop your opposition now because it's inevitable. And this is like the slippery slope. The problem is nothing is inevitable. There are no slippery slopes in this sense, right? The way that life works is, let's put it this way, T.S. Eliot says there's no such thing as a truly lost cause because there's no such thing as a truly won cause. As long as there are people in the mix in a democratic system fighting for what they believe in, no doors are closed yet. And, I can't tell you how rich you would be if you had a dime for every person who said get on the right side of history about the Equal Rights Amendment. Equal Rights Amendment didn't pass. If it's such an obvious proposition that it's the right side of history to support gay marriage, why has why have prohibitions on recognizing gay marriages passed in every state that have been put before the people? It's like something 30-odd states have supported it every single time, including liberal California. Right. Same thing with abortion. There are all of these things that everyone says it's inevitable that our side is going to win. And first of all, they're wrong. And second, they're wrong about what actually unfolded. And second of all, they're wrong to say it, because basically what it's doing is it betrays a certain lack of confidence in your own position, that you're trying to beg the other guy to give up now, right? I don't want to go 12 rounds with you because we both know you'll lose. So you should just take the TKO in the first round.
What do you do as conservatives and as the conservative movement? How do they start fighting back against this long, centuries-old pattern of progressives using these phrases and successfully using these phrases and cliches to gain and keep power?
Well,
what can we do?
First of all, it's just saying the slippery slope thing for 1 second, and it sort of ties into your thing. There's a tendency on the right to be incredibly pessimistic about everything, right? And I'm sure you've encountered this, and there's just the sense that today is worse than yesterday, and yesterday is worse than the day before, and all the rest. And first of all, it's absolutely not true about all sorts of really important things, right? Lots of conservatives think that we're less free than we ever were. Nonsense. It's certainly nonsense when it comes to blacks and women, right?
Right.
But it's nonsense in all sorts of ways. Free speech is more free today than it was, somewhat I believe, to our detriment, than it was at any time in American history. And that's thanks to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is more conservative than almost any time in American history, and that's thanks to groups like the Federalist Society and to people like Ronald Reagan, who's the first president since Woodrow Wilson started. Woodrow Wilson was the first president to openly denounce the U.S. Constitution as not relevant and should be replaced. And basically, every president after Wilson bought into the idea of the living Constitution until Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan and the Federalist Society started this generation-long process. And now the judiciary is more conservative. We have more serious legal intellectuals pushing back, fighting for a serious interpretation of the Constitution as a binding document. But that fight is obviously still ongoing, and it's been going on for the rest of our lives.
It has evolved almost. It has gotten even better since Reagan in a lot of ways.
Sure.
George W. Bush put two of the most conservative, strict constitutionalists on the court, even more so than Reagan.
Yeah, and they were both Federalist Society guys. And so my point is, it's that this is just one example of how the slippery slope was wrong, right? And that because you had dedicated people, and organizations like your organization, the organizations that I'm affiliated with, who weren't willing to give up and fought the good fight for a very long time and moved the center of gravity in American politics rightward, moved the judiciary rightward, moved our conception of these things rightward. And that's the sort of, the long-term lesson and goal of the book is, I get asked all the time, I go to conservative events, I give talks, and people say, how are we going to fix this? How are we going to solve that? And the short answer is, we're not. Because it is a long slog. It is an eternal fight. There will always be people who misunderstand the role of politics, misunderstand the role of government, think that they can get from government what they didn't get from their mommies and their daddies or their churches and their synagogues, or that their holes in their souls can be filled up by some bureaucrat in Washington. They will always exist. And the only way to keep them from triumphing is to make sure that people like you and me and the people listening to this exist too. And that's fine, because that's what democracy is about. It's an eternal struggle. It is a long fight. And the point of this book isn't to sort of win. I don't think any book can win, but it is to equip people with the ability to catch the other side in BS arguments, to spot these things when they hear it from others, and also when they hear themselves saying it. Saying, well, maybe there isn't such a thing as a right side of history. Mm-hmm. Maybe it isn't a slippery slope. Teach people that when they hear someone accusing the right of being social Darwinists, to be able to say, well, there's actually no such thing as social Darwinism. Or, when someone tries to slip something over the plate with talking about how social justice demands it, you can say, well, what do you mean by social justice? Because social justice is actually a really loaded term.
A couple more questions,
Sure.
Then I got to go rearrange my bongs. There's your interview with Piers Morgan. Mm-hmm. He's now, I think, famous on the internet, especially among conservatives, because he was, I don't know why he wanted to talk so much about the death of bin Laden.
Yeah.
We're obviously there to talk about something else. Do you think these cliches have an impact on the media and how the media reports the news?
Well, sure. Because
he clearly, Piers Morgan doesn't know that much about American politics. He's not a wonk.
I would have ended that sentence before American politics. But
do they buy? Is the reason why they're liberally biased because they buy into the idea that they're pragmatists, therefore they don't see their ideology?
It's an analog to the book, right? I mean, the point of I should have had a chapter on media bias. It's just I get sometimes so exhausted with media bias, not because it doesn't exist, but because everyone knows it does, and the other side just won't admit it, and it drives you a little batty sometimes. But the argument of the book is that liberals lie first and foremost to themselves about their own ideological preferences. It is the exact same analog to the way that the mainstream media works. I think that the vast majority of the people in the mainstream media honestly believe they're not biased. Doesn't mean they're not biased. It's how they sleep at night. The narrative they tell themselves is that they're objective and all that. And I used to listen to Tim Russert always used to say, I get hate mail from the left and right, as if this was dispositive of something. And
I must be in the middle if I'm getting hate mail from both sides.
And part of their own self-conception is I'm a centrist, I'm objective, and so therefore the politicians who spout these sort of centrist, objective, pieties about American politics, where they're sort of moderates in the middle, they get special treatment from the press because they reflect a lot of these journalists' own self-conception of themselves. And so, you have this political culture in Washington that is built up around the idea, they're like, ooh, shh, David Gergen's about to talk, as if like this is something that is really special. And I like David Gergen; he's a nice enough guy, but the idea that he is the font of all wisdom, or that somehow the different center is somehow more coherent or consistent is bizarre, right? I mean, at least I can give credit to people like Katrina vanden Heuvel, or Van Jones. They have a coherent political philosophy, even though Van Jones says that he's not a left-winger. He did admit in an interview once that he gave up talking in radical Marxist terms.
He's admitted he's an avowed communist, right?
Sure, but he says, I have given up, I have the exact quote in the book, but he has some lines sort of like, I have given up the short-term satisfaction of the revolutionary pose for the long-term satisfaction of revolutionary results, right? And so this is part of the shtick that a lot of activists on the left play, so I probably shouldn't have used them as an example, but of pretending not to be ideological in order to advance the ideological ball. But people like Katrina vanden Heuvel or Jonathan Chait, or they're liberal journalists who have a coherent, internally consistent view of the role of government, of politics, and all of that. I can give them the benefit of the doubt. I think the best journalism in America on the left and the right is opinion journalism. The long-form reported opinion piece, whether it's in the New Yorker or the New Republic or National Review or the Weekly Standard, is so much more effective because you have someone who's saying, look, here's where I'm coming from. I'm going to try and make an argument for what I believe is the right position. And here are my biases, so you can judge them for yourself, right? To me, that is so much more honest and compelling than an objective journalist who hides all their biases, pretending that they don't have an agenda. The comparison I always use is like in a court of law. We know the prosecutor is deeply biased in favor of prosecuting the accused. We know the defense attorney is deeply biased in getting an acquittal. But there are rules of evidence and there are rules of procedure that say, you have to deal with the other side's best arguments. You can't lie. You have to lay out a compelling argument. And if you don't do those things, you'll lose. To me, it's the same thing with opinion journalism. My colleague Ramesh Ponnuru at National Review always likes to say, I like to tackle the other side's best arguments, not their worst. It's a lot harder to do because their best arguments are obviously better than their weakest arguments. But to me, that's just so much more honest and useful than the facade of objectivity we get, where really the agenda is buried and you have to sort of figure out where's this guy really coming from.
Which is the way politicians usually speak.
Sure, of course, right.
All right, last thing.
Sure.
The most controversial part of the book has got to be when you talk about Gandhi.
Oh, yeah.
Now, I'm sure everything is true, but let me just sort of try to write this down in a long sentence. You describe Gandhi as basically a weird man, obsessed with bowel movements, responsible for the death of his wife, yet hypocritical when it came to saving his own. He was only able to achieve what he did because the British allowed it. He implored the British to surrender to the Nazis and encouraged Jews to basically commit suicide rather than fight the Nazis. Now, these are things that most people have no idea.
Yeah, they didn't make it into the movie.
Right. Have you gotten any feedback about this particular part of the book? Anyone who has challenged those assertions?
No, I mean they're all facts.
Okay.
I mean, I highly recommend people who are interested to read Orwell on Gandhi. It's all on the web. You can just Google Orwell and Gandhi, and you'll find all of this stuff. Paul Johnson has a lot of this stuff in Modern Times. Richard Grenier wrote about all of this in commentary a long time ago. And as I think I say somewhere in there, I find Gandhi, of all of the really creepy cult of personality leaders of the 20th century, one of the most admirable. Because the one thing he wasn't was a hypocrite about his own lifestyle.
Oh, he lived it. He walked the walk.
Yeah, I mean, the guy, this is a family broadcast, so I won't get into his views on sex. But he was internally consistent about a lot of this kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, it is absolutely true that, as Orwell says, if there are Gandhis in the Soviet Union or Nazi Germany, we will never know about it because they'll be carted off in the middle of the night,
sent to the gulag.
And that's
right.
It's an important point because when people say when people on the left say things like violence never solved anything, or one of my favorites is, all I'm saying is give peace a chance. And what I always love about it is that it's honest, because that's right. That's all they're saying is give peace a chance. Nothing helpful or productive, right? I mean, imagine you're in the Situation Room in the White House, and the North Koreans have just spilled over the DMZ, and they're going to take Seoul, and maybe 2 million lives are going to be lost, and we may get into a war with China over it, and it could be, a conflagration that sets the world back 30 years, and one dippy dude in the back of the room with open-toed shoes and a closed mind, who looks like Shaggy from Scooby-Doo.
This guy.
Yeah, that guy.
That guy in the book.
It says, hey, wait a second, I have an idea. Give peace a chance.
Just wait.
Yeah.
Just chill.
Absolutely useless suggestion. And yet it is elevated in our culture as one of these things that we're supposed to find admirable and idealistic when someone says it. Like violence never solved anything. And that's sort of why I wrote the book. I go on college campuses, kids, I'm the first conservative to be invited in like 5 years. And I'll say something like, a strong national defense is essential to prosperity and peace, or, the usual Reaganite ideological line, because that's what I believe, is the Reaganite ideological line. And some kid will say, that sounds really ideological. I was like, no shit, Sherlock, of course it sounds ideological. That's why I'm here. That's why you invited me. I'm a, conservative. And yet they'll say things like, besides, I just think violence never solved anything, as if that's not an ideological statement, as if that's just something that everyone agrees on and thinks is wonderful, and besides, I read it in a Hallmark card, so it has to be true. And the more you start paying attention, the more you realize that Orwell says in Politics in the English Language that these cliches sort of come like prefabricated hen houses that come constructed, and they sort of do your thinking for you. And so much of what passes for education in America is really an attempt to sort of instantiate in people's minds these prefabricated hen houses of cliches that force people into thinking one way about the world. And what liberals who have been indoctrinated with this stuff call ideology are really simply just competing inconvenient arguments that disrupt the cliches that are in their own heads.
Jonah Goldberg, American Enterprise Institute. The book is The Tyranny of Cliches, How Liberals Cheat in the War of Ideas. It's going to be a big hit. Great book. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks
Appreciate it.
Me too.
Absolutely.
Thank you.